given the privilege burden of chairing this session, but it is a privilege because of the speaker whom I'm just about to introduce, Sheridan Gilley, whom I've known for a very long time, but only intermittently over the years. For those of you who don't know that much about him, he spent most of his career in the University of Durham teaching theology and ecclesiastical history. And among his formal distinctions, he was for a time president of the Ecclesiastical History Society, which is in England a very flourishing body, at least because of the contributions made by various presidents. At the moment, in retirement, I think I'm right in saying that he is a fellow, a research fellow, in the new Centre for Catholic Studies in the University of Durham. And I would imagine many people in this room know quite a bit about what's been going on in Durham in this relatively uncharted field of Catholic studies within higher education. But Sheridan Gilley is best known, I think, as an expert on Newman. And we're lucky to have him giving one of our lead papers here this morning on Newman. He published, I think I'm right in saying, the book on Newman and his age in 1990. Another, I'm being very selective, another link that he has with this conference is that we were going to hear, I don't think Sister Moore has mentioned this, I'm not sure how widely it's known, we were going to hear Vincent Allen McClelland, retired Professor of Education at the University of Hull, speak about developments in the 19th century on which he's a bit of an expert, on which he is an expert. I should not use the word a bit of. Unfortunately, Professor McClelland had a pretty nasty accident. He fell over a few weeks ago and was not able to be participating in this conference, which is a great pity because I wanted to meet him again after not having seen him for several years. His company is delightful. But the reason why I mention him now is that Sheridan, along with another editor whose name escapes me, whom I don't know, a few years ago presented the Festschrift to Alan McClelland. So the loop, as it were.
It was Ego Solus.
Solus?
Yes, I did it myself.
I beg your pardon.
All my own work.
Yeah, historians are divided between those who do things in collaboration and those who do things on their own. I now know that you're in the other category.
No, I'm in the other category.
So let's welcome Sheridan Gilley.
It's a great honour to address the conference. It has always seemed strange to me that while universities are staffed by scholars who sometimes write the histories of their own institutions, such as the striking new history of the University of Oxford, there are, relatively speaking, so few books about the character and purpose of universities themselves. For the most part, academics are devoted to their own discipline and take their profession for granted. Like the fly walking on water, if only they should stop to think on how to do it, they would sink. John Henry Newman's own thought about the matter has a wider theological setting in his attempts to relate the three often conflicting ideals of faith, reason, and order, corresponding, as he puts it himself, to three great cities of the European imagination: Athens as a city of reason, Rome as a city of order, and Jerusalem as a city of faith. In Newman's developed ecclesiology, order belongs to the regal office of ruling, present supremely in the church in the papacy. Reason comes under the prophetical office, which is the work of the theologian, and worship or devotion is the aim or end of the priestly office, exercised by the priesthood and people. All three offices of rule, reason, and worship have a virtue and a vice, as worship can become superstition, reason can become rationalism or liberalism, of which more anon, and order can become tyranny, as Newman himself sometimes thought was true, of the pontificate of Pope Pius IX. These ideals are therefore hard to reconcile, having a nasty habit of getting in the way of one another, as when reason or rationalism attacks superstition or tyranny, or even, as Newman thought, the Catholic faith itself. In Newman's own lifetime, the Academy came into conflict with the papacy when much of the German Catholic professoriate rejected the definition of papal infallibility at the First Vatican Council and departed into liberal Catholicism. Here, and pertinent to our inquiry, there is the difficulty of reconciling the reason of Athens with the Jerusalem of faith, the critical intellect in the realm of historical scholarship with the regal authority of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. More recent disputes over Hans Kung in Germany and the claims of the magisterium to authority in Ex Corde Ecclesiae, and in the matter of Father Charles Curran in North America, have something of the same character. How then does the university fit into Newman's general scheme? Universities, he wrote, are the centres of intellectual movements. Not always true, as so many such movements in the modern world have taken place outside them. But the university has traditionally supplied the church with learning, knowledge, and intellect. Newman was acutely aware that our Western universities were the invention of medieval Catholic Europe, as David has told us. Not least his own beloved University of Oxford, though the classical world about which he also wrote could claim to have had institutions which he thought were like them. But as with any work of intellect and the imagination, Newman's idea of the university was the product of its time and place. The Irish Catholic Church, after 1840, was divided over the principle of the mixed education of Protestants and Catholics, and therefore about whether to take part in Sir Robert Peel's non-denominational Queen's Colleges in Ireland, which was then in any case forbidden by Rome. In consequence, in 1851, Newman was invited by the Irish bishops to become the rector of a new Catholic university in Ireland, at the instigation of the Pope's man in Ireland, the papal legate, then Archbishop of Armagh, Paul Cullen, later Cardinal Cullen, Archbishop of Dublin. The university opened in Dublin in 1854. Newman could not reject the invitation regarding education as from first to last his own line. For its organisation, he looked to the model of the Belgian Catholic University of Louvain, under a central council and rector, not governed by the heads of its constituent colleges like Oxford. But it was his Oxford background and training that inspired his ambition to create in Dublin a Catholic university for the English-speaking world. Newman's lectures on university education began in the Dublin Rotunda in 1852 with an audience of around 400, while he was still in the throes of the Achille trial for libel, when he was at risk of imprisonment himself. The work then had a complicated history of publication. Part 1 was published as Discourses on University Education in 1852, Part 2 as The Scope and Nature of University Education in 1859. Newman only later drastically edited them together into their modern form as The Idea of a University Defined and Illustrated in 1873. His Dublin lectures on the history of the classical and medieval universities, with even a nod to Islam, were separately published in the Dublin Catholic University Gazette, and then appeared in the Office and Work of Universities in 1856, and later in Volume 3 of Historical Sketches, as quite a different work. There were to be 7 further editions of the idea in Newman's own lifetime, suggesting that even then it had its readers. He tinkered with the text, as was his custom, until the collected edition of 1889. There have been further modern editions, including those by Ian Kerr, Martin Spaglik and Frank Turner. There are at least 3 important books on Newman in Ireland, with his own memoranda, and there is his Irish correspondence and a copious secondary literature, including a book about his personal engagement with the work, as we were told this morning, by the great scholar Jaroslav Pelikan. In all his labour, however, Newman was essentially the heir of an English learned tradition, and his aim was twofold: to recommend to Catholics the Oxford idea of a liberal education as a training of the mind rather than as the acquisition of useful knowledge, and to show how it could be combined with the Catholic faith. Newman's Oxford vision, delivered to an Irish Catholic audience, had more than a touch of irony about it, as Oxford had raised up generations of English Protestants who had, in Irish eyes, been oppressing Irish Catholics for centuries. Moreover, Newman, an Englishman, went to Ireland less than a decade after Ireland had suffered the Great Famine, in which about 1 million people had died and another 1.5 million had fled abroad. The irony was deepened by the divisions among Irish Catholics, an honest people to amend Dr. Johnson, who never speak well of one another. And the background to Newman's work was the conflict between Archbishop Cullen and his archiepiscopal enemy, John McHale, Archbishop of Tuam, christened by O'Connell Lion of the Tribe of Judah, who wanted a primarily national university, while the Irish Catholic middle class demanded a useful institution for training doctors, lawyers and teachers. Newman claimed to have gone to Dublin at the wish of the Pope, out of a trust in the supernatural providence attending Rome's designs, which is the theme of a glorious passage of rhetoric in the idea on the papacy's role in history. He concluded, however, that I was a poor innocent as regards the actual state of things in Ireland when I went there, and did not care to think about it, for I relied upon the word of the Pope, but from the event I am led to think it not rash to say that I knew as much about Ireland as he did. Newman found it exhausting conducting the oratory in Birmingham while governing the university in Dublin, as he made 56 journeys in 8 years, back and forth across the Irish Sea. Cardinal Wiseman, the Archbishop of Westminster, made a well-meaning attempt to strengthen Newman's hand by creating him a bishop, and he was presented by friends with his episcopal regalia, only to have this English appointment, an undiplomatic intrusion into another country's church, secretly vetoed by Cullen. McHale was hostile to Cullen's central role as he saw it, and to Newman's English appointments, while Cullen had a clerical dislike of Newman's conception of an educated middle-class laity in a university funded by the pennies of the poor. Cullen, the reverse mirror of McHale in this, had an animus against some of Newman's more Irish nationalist appointments, and against some of Newman's more lordly undergraduates, who occasioned unfriendly gossip about their handsome horses and billiards room, and he would not answer Newman's letters. It was no wonder that Newman resigned his rectorship in 1858, leaving the lovely little Byzantine university church, which he had built with the subscriptions from the Achillea Fair, and what was to become a great classical volume behind him. The university ultimately became part of the Irish National University. There are considerations other than its Irish setting which seem to limit the idea of a university to the circumstances of its time and place. From the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, a knowledge of the Greek and Latin classics had been the central strand of European culture, its unifying element. And Newman himself, in his essay In Aid of a Grammar of Assent, wrote the most enchanting account of their continuing imaginative power. Thus a boy who had thought some passages of Homer or Horace fine in his youth, he wrote, will find when older that they pierce him with their sad exactness and vivid earnestness. Then he comes to understand how it is that lines, the birth of some chance morning or evening at an Ionian festival, or among the Sabine hills, have lasted generation after generation, for thousands of years with a power over the mind and a charm which the current literature of his own day, with all its obvious advantages, is utterly unable to rival. Perhaps this is the reason of the medieval opinion about Virgil, as if a prophet or magician, his single words and phrases, his pathetic half-lines, giving utterance as the voice of nature herself to that pain and weariness, yet hope of better things, which is the experience of her children in every time. Newman inherited his understanding of the importance of the classics from his own university training and his mentors in his own Oxford College of Oriel, especially Edward Copleston, and from the great controversy of half a century before, between 1808 and 1810, with the Whig or Scottish writers in the Edinburgh Review, who extolled the superior character of the education provided by the 5 ancient Scottish universities. Aberdeen claimed to have 2, remember. The background to this dispute lay in the hostility of the reforming Whig Edinburgh reviewers to the role of Oxford as a reactionary stronghold of English Toryism in an age of revolution, and as the champion of the alliance of the English Church and State with an English undergraduate clientele which was largely rich and privileged. In fact, most Scottish students were middle class, but the often excellent Scottish parochial schools partially justified the proud claim of Scottish higher education to be democratic by attracting a minority of poorer peasant students. Certainly there was nothing in Scotland corresponding to Oxford's strutting, golden-gowned and gold-tufted noblemen with their lordly privileges, or to the gentlemen commoners who were to seem such an obstacle to reform of the system to the young Oriel tutor, Newman himself. One of the participants in the debate in the Edinburgh, the celebrated wit, the Reverend Sidney Smith, a radical Anglican cleric and not himself a Scottish graduate, connected the political conservatism of Oxford with the excessive abuse of classical learning in England, over such matters as with whom Pan slept, with whom Jupiter, whom Apollo ravished, and with the safe and elegant imbecility of classical learning. The curriculum of the Scottish universities was proud to be determined instead by philosophers like Thomas Reid and Dugald Stewart, who imparted a general training of the mind, not so much in facts as in general principles, and through such studies of great benefit to statesmen and society as medicine and economics, or as it was called, political economy, in which Scotland could claim a particular preeminence. The Edinburgh reviewers also attacked the predominance in the curriculum of Oxford as they conceived it of deductive Aristotelian logic, which they saw as another pillar of political conservatism, whereas the scientific method of induction from experiment, expounded by Francis Bacon, was, they thought, the basis of true intellectual progress. There were, however, paradoxically, anticipations of Newman's idea of a university in the Scottish attack on his beloved Oxford, especially in its criticism of Aristotle's logic and its emphasis on a broad training of the mind, rather than on a set of narrow specialisms. The Scottish system might tend to what Newman called viewiness, on assertion based on opinion without special knowledge. The Scottish stress on useful knowledge might also seem to be the least Newmanian aspect of the reviewer's attack. Newman had no objection to utility or to vocational training as such, and his greatest success in Dublin is generally agreed to have been his medical school in Cecilia Street, the first such Catholic institution in Ireland. He planned departments of science and engineering, a law school, and an observatory. Medicine and law were, after all, traditional university subjects. But these were not for him the point of a university education. Newman's particular bugbear was the English utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham, with his criterion of the good is what is useful to make mankind happy, the basis for a liberal or Whig programme of political reform. Newman assailed the whole idea of a merely useful knowledge in 1841 in a series of letters to the Times attacking the reforming Tory Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel, afterwards republished as the Tamworth Reading Room, one of the finest polemical works he ever wrote. For Newman, the end or aim of education could never be merely practical. Like many a conflict between the English and Scots, this dispute was fraught with misunderstanding. The Scots' conception of a useful education was a very general one, and not just a professional training as a doctor or a dominie. Where the Scottish reviewers were partly wrong was in their low opinion of the English education in the classics. English boys were better versed in Latin and Greek, spending most of their time in writing verses and translations, and so Oxford could build on the foundation thereby acquired, and this made the undergraduate curriculum in part a philosophical one. In his Ethics, Aristotle himself qualifies the idea of a certain deductive logic by arguing that moral truths do not have the certainty of mathematical ones, in what amounts to a logic of probabilities, which was to be the cornerstone of Newman's justification of the role of reason in matters of faith and morals, in his essay In Aid of a Grammar of Assent. Paradoxically, the Oxford system had the same aim as the Scottish system, the training of the mind, not just the absorption of linguistic or historical facts, as can be seen in the riposte to the Edinburgh reviewers by Newman's mentor Edward Copleston. Coplestone's life was one of a distinction so effortless that it has hardly left an obvious memorial. But it was Copleston who, with Provost John Evely of Oriel, put through the new examination statute in 1800, which under the revisions of 1803 and 1807 introduced two new honours schools in Oxford, in Literae Humaniores or Classics, and Mathematics and Physics. Professor Ward hints that these two schools narrowed the range of undergraduate learning, as those subjects taught by professors but not examined, like mineralogy and chemistry, lost students and prestige in consequence. But the new examination certainly intensified Oxford education by giving bright undergraduates, like Newman's great friend John Keble, a set of first-class honours to achieve. Dr. David Newsom has said that by the 1820s, Oxford had undergone a scholarly renaissance among its aspirants to academic honours. It was the school and seminary after the defeat of Napoleon, of the ruling class of a nation which was now mistress of the seas and workshop of the world. The revised examination statute of 1803 includes not only Greek and Roman languages, but rhetoric and moral philosophy, insofar as they are derivable from ancient authors, and a large place for Aristotle among the works studied, his ethics and rhetoric, as well as his writings on logic. Aristotle was always for Newman the philosopher. Aristotle gave the Oxford curriculum a general bias to the study of fundamental subjects, to logic as the structure of human thought, and to ethics as the mainspring of human action. A philosophical bias, which was, in a less specialised and intensive sense, the bias of the Scottish universities as well. Newman matriculated at the university in 1816 when he was 15, as this intellectual renaissance gathered pace. And it was out of this renaissance that Newman's Oxford movement was to come, and with it the movement's crusade in the 1830s to re-Catholicise the Church of England. The Scottish attack on Oxford therefore occurred at a time when Oxford was already in reforming mode and in a strong position to reply. Copleston was a literary terrorist in his assault on the Edinburgh reviewers, especially on the classical learning of One Payne Knight, a dilettante notorious for writing about Roman phallic objects and for telling Lord Elgin that his marbles were Roman copies, and who, so Copleston wrote, showed a depraved appetite which seeks its gratification in everything that is fetid and disagreeable to the uncorrupted palate. But it was Copleston's defence of Oxford's use of Aristotle's rhetoric, which the undergraduate Newman had to translate line by line. It gets to the heart of Newman's later teaching. Aristotle, wrote Copleston, sought then, if ever man did, in the living pattern of the human heart, all the recesses and windings of that region he explored, all its caprices and affections, whatever tends to excite, to ruffle, to amuse, to gratify, or to offend. And this was the answer to what Copleston thought was the Edinburgh Reviewer's emphasis on practical usefulness, on what relieves suffering and serves the economy and creates comfort and makes money, good those these ends are. And education is concerned instead with things beyond measure, with all that constitutes the grace, the beauty, the charm, the dignity of composition, all that tend to awake the fancy and affect the heart. Thus the classics create a liberal education fostering what Newman later called the enlargement of mind, the cultivation of mind, an imperial power in the sense of a ruling one, a general ability to detect nonsense, to reason and to judge. As Newman was to say, there must surely be a cultivation of mind which is in itself a good of the highest order, without any immediate reference to bodily appetites or wants of any kind, or obvious usefulness, or as Newman quotes Copleston on a liberal education in the idea, a university education should be liberal in the sense of being the free education of a free man, and not the manual education of a servile one, without directly qualifying a man for any of the employments of life, say as a doctor or lawyer. It enriches and ennobles all, without teaching him the business of any one office or calling. It enables him to act his part in each of them with better grace and more elevated carriage, and if happily planned and conducted, is the main ingredient in that complete and generous education which fits a man, citing Milton, to perform justly, skillfully, and magnanimously all the offices, both private and public, of war and peace. Thus, liberal education trains the powers of judgment in a wider sphere, the habit of discrimination, the power of stating a question distinctly and of urging with perspicuity, are of much greater importance than the hasty acquisition of miscellaneous knowledge. Those of us who think learning Greek and Latin is a dry as dust exercise in pointless pedantry should recognize the humanism for which it was the foundation. It was thus that Copleston saw the moral product of such an education in the histories of Herodotus and Thucydides. A high sense of honour, a disdain for death in a good cause, a passionate devotion to the welfare of one's country, a love of enterprise and a love of glory are among the first sentiments which these studies communicate to the mind. They tend to inspire just and elevated thoughts, though not merely adapted to solitude and contemplation, but to the intercourse of social life and to the discharge of the most active duties. And for Newman, as for Copleston, how best to strengthen, refine, and enrich the intellectual powers was bound up with this classical curriculum. The perusal of the poets, historians, and philosophers of Greek and Rome, wrote Newman in The Idea, will accomplish this purpose, as long experience has shown. But that the study of the experimental sciences will do the like is proved to us as yet by no experience whatever. As Newman quoted Aristotle and Cicero, knowledge is its own end. This then was to be Newman's argument, that knowledge acquired through a liberal education is an end in itself, even though such an education has an end beyond itself, enabling the educated man to do what the uneducated man cannot do, in fitting such a man to do anything. To create this paragon, the university gives him a sense of there being such a thing as universal knowledge, in which different disciplines stand in a relation to one another. Even more, the student learns a mastery of method, the idea of science, method, order, principle, and system, of rule and exception, of richness and harmony. Thus, Newman's idea of a university is essentially a philosophical idea, regulated by a secular understanding, not a theological one. A university being in itself and in its end no more necessarily religious than a hospital which aims to cure diseases. The idea of a university is the cultivation and impartation of knowledge, not the inculcation of Christian truth. Newman was himself the hard-working product of the new examination system of the Oxford Honours Schools in classics and mathematics, introduced, as I've said, in the opening decade of the century. But his mediocre degree in 1820 in classics, below the line, with what we might call a 2-2, for him as now definitely the not all right degree, and his inability to achieve honours in mathematics made him a failure of the system. He rationalised his crisis over his finals, which was later compounded by his collapse as an examiner in the schools in 1827, as the product of a conflict within himself between intellectual and moral excellence, a distinction which survives into the idea. He was saved from scholarly oblivion in 1822 by winning his fellowship at Oriel, the most intellectual of the colleges, said to be academic immortality, symbolised by its circulating teapot, which had replaced the usual bottles of port, and habitual drunkenness of the 2-bottle fellows of the Oxford senior common rooms. For all his fluency in Latin and Greek, Newman had been educated at a private school, not a public one, and was not a well-drilled classicist adept at churning out Latin verses or a Cantabrigian tyro in mathematics. And his own talents were precisely those which the Scottish system was supposed to foster, that fine taste in composition and power of philosophical judgment and argument, in which Copleston said, recognising the limitations of the general honours examinations, Newman rose above the quackery of the schools. But as Oxford was concerned with the training of the imperial intellect, and not just of persons who are good at passing examinations, so it produces, and here Newman sounds quaint, a moral type of the gentleman, which Newman himself mocks as that antiquated variety of human nature and remnant of feudalism. We should remember this qualification in looking at Newman's description of the gentleman in one of his great passages of musical prose, which was at one time used by my old-fashioned optician to test my eyes. Here is a snatch of it. The true gentleman in like manner carefully avoids whatever may cause a jar or a jolt in the minds of those with whom he is conversing, all clashing of opinion or collision of feeling, all restraint or suspicion or gloom or resentment, his great concern being to make every one at ease and at home. He is tender towards the bashful, gentle towards the distant, and merciful towards the absurd. He can recollect to whom he is speaking. He guards against unseasonable allusions or topics which may irritate. He is seldom prominent in conversation and never wearisome. He never speaks of himself except when compelled, never defends himself by a mere retort. He has no ears for slander or gossip, is scrupulous in interpreting motives to those who interfere with him, and interprets everything for the best. He is never mean or little in his disputes, never takes unfair advantage, never mistakes personalities or sharp sayings for arguments, or insinuates evil which he dare not say out. From a long-sighted prudence, he observes the maxim of the ancient sage, that we should ever conduct ourselves towards our enemy, as if he were one day to be our friend. He has too much good sense to be affronted at insults. He is too well employed to remember injuries, and indolent to bear malice. He is patient, forbearing, and resigned on philosophical principles. He submits to pain because it is inevitable, to bereavement because it is irreparable, and to death because it is his destiny. And so on. It is clear that this marvellous chap is a social type and not just an individual one. A university training is the great ordinary means to a great but ordinary end. It aims at raising the intellectual tone of society, at cultivating the public mind, at purifying the national taste, at supplying true principles to popular enthusiasm, and fixed aims to popular aspiration, at giving enlargement and sobriety to the ideas of the age, at facilitating the exercise of political power, and refining the intercourse of private life. At some point in this, you ought to be giving yourselves a pat on the back. It is the education which gives a man a clear, conscious view of his own judgments, a truth in developing them, an eloquence in expressing them, and a force in urging them. It teaches him to see things as they are, to go right to the point, to disentangle a skein of thought, to detect what is sophistical and to discard what is irrelevant. It prepares him to fill any post with credit and to master any subject with facility. It shows him how to accommodate himself to others, how to throw himself into their state of mind, how to bring before them his own, how to influence them, how to come to an understanding with them, how to bear with them. He is at home in any society. He has common ground with every class. He knows when to speak and when to be silent. He is able to converse. He is able to listen. He can ask a question pertinently and gain a lesson seasonably when he has nothing to impart himself. He is ever ready, yet never in the way. He is a pleasant companion and a comrade you can depend upon. He knows when to be serious and when to trifle. And he has a sure tact which enables him to trifle with gracefulness and to be serious with effect. How, in his recent little work on universities, asks Stephen Collini, in some exasperation, protesting at Newman's excessive rhetoric, could a mere 3-year degree given over to classics and mathematics do all of this, even unto knowing when to be serious and when to trifle? Not a matter on which I've ever instructed my students. I think that Collini overlooks some of the concomitant aspects of Newman's scheme. In fact, it's not just the formal curriculum which creates the gentleman through its philosophical and classical content, but, as we shall see, residence with the students of his own age, their common life and experience, and all that this implies. So much for Athens. What of Jerusalem? I have said nothing much of Christianity in all of this. In fact, Newman has a sharply defined view of the limitations of the gentleman, who is the creation not of Christianity, but of civilization. Newman's account of the gentleman as one who never inflicts pain is sometimes taken for praise. But Oxbridge man as such, and he is definitely male, is, by and in himself, Aristotle's philosopher who never knew the things of Christ. Newman's conception of an academic, need I say this, is not necessarily a Christian one. Some of the characteristics of the gentleman are distinctly ambiguous, as when Newman asserts that he is too indolent to bear malice. Indolence is a poor excuse from a Christian viewpoint for a lack of malice. Moreover, the gentleman, if he is an unbeliever, and he may well be, will be too profound and large-minded to ridicule religion or to act against it. He is a friend of religious toleration, and that not only because his philosophy has taught him to look on all forms of faith with an impartial eye, not essentially a Christian view, it might be said, but also from the gentleness and effeminacy of feeling which is attendant on civilization. The tolerance and civilization attended by gentleness and effeminacy of feeling is not Christianity. In short, the gentleman appears as a sort of well-mannered social conservative with a small c. Indeed, to a rough Australian like me, a very English type. There's lots of reserve there. Moderating the excitements and passions of a wider public, and against this we might think of the value of quite other moral types, the inventor, explorer, discoverer, or in Newman's own case, the controversialist. Indeed, Newman seems to be describing the university which creates the gentleman as a peaceful republic of letters which has never existed. It certainly did not describe Newman's own war-torn and tumultuous experience of Oxford, compared by Richard Church to Florence in its most violent days, with all Oxford's cabals and theological controversy. True, the gentleman with some editing of Newman's text may become a Christian saint, but not all saints are gentlemen, and not all gentlemen are saints. My own experience of universities suggests that academic saints are rather uncommon. Newman, during his career, revered such gentlemen saints as his friend John Keble and the founder of his oratory, St. Philip Neri. But he also loved saints who were definitely not gentlemen, such as the peasant Blessed Dominic Barbary, who had received him into the Catholic Church and is said to have convulsed a convent of nuns with his rough English by declaring that without face you cannot be shaved. The gentleman as a moral type requires Christianity for his education into Christian wisdom. Some of Newman's Dublin audience must have smiled when they thought of those English gentlemen who had so blithely looked on the agony of Ireland. Though some of the more conservative among them may have contemplated with pleasure the kind of social conservatism which Newman commends as a curb on their own revolutionary tradition. Beyond Newman's imagination was the concentration camp commander who went home in the evenings to play Beethoven to his family. Academic cultivation is not Christianity. What then was Newman doing in recommending this seemingly secular educational ideal of gentlemanly civilization to Irish Catholics? It is, however, his point that is the very moral inadequacy, the very shortcomings of the man of cultivation that so urgently requires the corrective and supplement of religion. Without religion, this is what you get. To grasp Newman's understanding of the role of the Christian university, we must look to his primary analysis of the relations between faith and reason in the university sermons which he preached between 1826 and 1843, all but the first in his role as vicar from 1827 of the University Church of St. Mary the Virgin. Newman's sermons derive the moral and religious sense not from reason, but from conscience, which gives us our apprehension of God as the king and judge and lawgiver to whom we owe obedience, and our intimations of a moral law which we are bound to obey. Conscience, not reason, is for Newman the foundation of natural religion, belief in God and morality. As he would later say, conscience is a pope within us, pointing the individual to the divine revelation which completes and fulfills its commands. In this sense, Jerusalem comes before Athens, and the Christian university is an institution in which reason develops on the foundation of an a priori faith in Christianity and the moral law, and Athens which is in harmony with Jerusalem, in an institution of learning which is religious in profession. The outcome is a Christian wisdom in which faith and reason reinforce each other. But the university by and of itself offers us only a secular idea, which then requires Christianization. Newman was in Dublin then, still thinking of an older religious Oxford. But this very Oxbridge system was under challenge in his youth, not only from Scotland, but from the foundation in 1826 of a new non-denominational institution, the so-called Godless University College in Gower Street, which admitted its students without religious tests. University College, the work of Whigs and Radicals, was part of a wider movement of civil rights for non-Anglicans, which climaxed in the repeal of the Test Incorporation Acts in 1828 and the Third Catholic Emancipation Act in 1829, giving nonconformists and Catholics nearly full rights of membership in the very Parliament which held authority over the Church of England. This battle between Anglicans and others was fought on many fronts over the 19th century, especially in Oxford, and the young Newman was the anti-reforming product of an unreformed Oxford, which was confessionally Anglican, requiring compulsory chapel attendance and subscription by undergraduates and matriculation to the 39 Articles of the Church of England. Newman in his youth had been a stout defender of the union of church and state, and actually campaigned against the university's MP, Robert Peel, in 1829 for voting for Catholic emancipation. And his Oxford movement was founded in 1833 to show that only Catholicism of an Anglican type could rescue the Church of England from its non-Anglican enemies. But Newman's newly defined Anglo-Catholicism was a liberal Trojan horse within a confessional stronghold, as he found himself in an increasing difficulty. The university kept itself Anglican by making its members, undergraduates and teachers, subscribe to the 39 Articles, and only radical Anglicans like Wren, Dixon, Hampden, to whom Newman was bitterly opposed, argued for the abolition of subscription. The Articles, however, are a moderate statement of 16th century Protestant teaching, and Newman's own developing Anglo-Catholicism was a challenge to this very Protestantism. Newman tried to show in Tract 90 in 1841 that the Protestant Articles could be reconciled to his own understanding of Anglo-Catholicism. But this partly sophistical exercise caused a national scandal in a nation which was still overwhelmingly Protestant. It has been said that Tract 90 destroyed Newman's usefulness to the Church of England, as nearly every Anglican bishop in the country fulminated against it as a surrender to Rome. How then could you build Jerusalem in the Athens of Oxford if Anglicans were divided into Protestants and Catholics and could not agree on what Jerusalem was? Then Newman left the fray by becoming a Roman Catholic with some of his followers in 1845. By splitting the forces which defended the Anglican monopoly in Oxford, Newman greatly weakened that monopoly, resulting in the large-scale secularization of the university later in the century. He was, despite himself, an inadvertent secularizer. Subscription to the Articles for Oxford undergraduates was abolished in the mid-1850s, and the student body was thrown open to all comers at the very time when Newman was lecturing in Dublin. In 1871, the teaching posts in all subjects except divinity in Oxford, Cambridge, and the new Confessional University of Durham were opened up to men of all religious and none, leading to Newman's bitter remark in 1875 in his letter to the Duke of Norfolk that no one mourned more than he the state of Oxford, given up, alas, and here he quotes the Pope, to liberalism and progress, to the forfeiture of her great medieval motto, Dominus Illuminatio Mea, the Lord my light, with the consequent call on her to go to Parliament or the Herald's College for a new one. For Newman, liberalism had triumphed in Oxford in his understanding of the bad sense of liberal, meaning the anti-dogmatic principle which declares that religious truth doesn't matter and that for all practical purposes one religion is as good as another. Oxford, in his view, was no longer, in any sense, a Christian university, though he thought that with proper safeguards Catholics might attend it. But he lost his great battle in the 1860s with his more ultramontane fellow Catholics like Archbishop Manning to establish an oratory in Oxford. Rome thought, on what it thought was the best English advice, that Oxford might endanger the faith of Catholic students and that Newman's presence might attract them there. The papal ban on Oxford attendance was to be reversed in 1896 by Pope Leo XIII after Newman's death. Yet the strangest aspect of the unreformed Oxford system when Newman was young was the lack of provision of a theological formation for its members. It communicated Anglicanism instead by a kind of cultural osmosis. Very few of the great Anglican theologians, from Richard Hooker to Bishops Berkeley and Butler, had been professional academics. Most were working clergymen. There was no Oxford undergraduate degree in theology in Newman's time, though there were 2 professors of divinity, and this is the more remarkable when one considers that an Oxford or Cambridge degree was normally regarded as a sufficient, indeed the only necessary, qualification for priestly ordination. The Anglican ministry was until quite late in the century a profession for gentlemen who had received the general education of other gentlemen. It was only in the 1830s that Anglican theological seminaries appeared to replace or supplement this meagre preparation with a directly vocational training. And this was at first an option for ordination, not a requirement. There was some instruction in the Greek New Testament at Oxford, otherwise, as Newman described the system of his youth, a routine lecture delivered to successive batches of young men destined for the Protestant ministry, not during their residence, but when they were leaving or had already left the university, and not about dogmatics, history, ecclesiastical law, or casuistry, but about a list of authors to be selected and works to be read by those who had neither curiosity to read them nor money to purchase. And again, there was a lecture on a periodical advertisement on the 39 Articles, which was never delivered because it was never attended. These two demonstrations, one undertaken by one theological professor, the other by another, comprised the theological teaching of a seat of learning which had been the home of Duns Scotus and Alexander of Hales. Strange the Christian university whose theological education had been reduced to 2 lectures, one never given for want of an audience. It was only the Church of England's weakening power in Oxford which produced in 1869 the creation of an Anglican divinity faculty for aspirants to the priesthood. The Honour School in Theology were founded in Oxford in 1870 and 1871. Minerva took her flight when night was falling, as the Anglican ministry became a little more like a profession, and the university assumed its modern secular mould. In this, even old Oxford had fallen short of Newman's idea. Against this for Newman, a Catholic university had to teach theology because it aspires to teach all subjects. Both Catholic and university implied universality. Indeed, Newman urged in the idea that if the Catholic faith is true, a university cannot exist externally to the Catholic pale, for it cannot teach universal knowledge if it does not teach Catholic theology. The Church is necessary for its integrity. Not that its main characters are changed by this incorporation, it still has the office of intellectual education, but the Church steadies it in the performance of that office. In short, Catholic Christianity helps the university to perform its proper functions. One of Newman's arguments has a particular interest to us, that in the absence of theology, other disciplines will encroach beyond their proper area, as he thought that ethics had been invaded by the teachings of political economy. Those of us who dislike the morality of our business schools might take heart from this. Yet he seems to dismiss the possibility of a secular or pagan university, which does not teach Catholic theology, for lacking an essential subject for its intellectual completion. Against the grain of his own argument, that a university exists to create the imperial intellect, which on the face of it might coexist with any religion that acknowledged the desirability of learning. There seems to me to be a tension, if not a contradiction, between Newman's idea of a university in the abstract and his concrete idea of a Catholic one. What is unclear is also, to use a Newmanian word, how the ethos of a Catholic university is to influence secular subjects so that it envelops every subject in an atmosphere of its own. What might help is the fundamental importance which Newman ascribes to student residence, arguing that the residential university, as in Oxbridge, unlike the non-residential London University, which he disliked for all sorts of reasons, would give students the necessary experience of their own generation, in which they do as much as their teachers to educate one another. For Newman, students educate one another. His view of residence was informed, of course, by his love of the genius loci, or spirit of the place, of his own beloved Oxford. For Newman, a university is a true alma mater, and her sons ought to love her in return. The university is a place which wins the admiration of the young by its celebrity, kindles the affection of the middle-aged by its beauty, and rivets the fidelity of the old by its associations. One of Newman's deepest emotions was his loyalty to Oxford, and he might be said, with his secular disciple Matthew Arnold, to have created the modern romantic cultus of that place, symbolised for Newman by the snapdragon on the wall of Trinity, the emblem of his residence unto death in his own university. One of his deepest regrets as a Catholic was his exile from her. One of the joys of his old age was his honorary fellowship at his undergraduate college of Trinity. A university without residence for students was not, for Newman, a university. Given the cost of residence, one wonders whether this will survive distance learning, the internet, and the model of the Open University. More unfashionable and arguable is Newman's insistence that the university is essentially a place of teaching, not research, which should be pursued in specialist institutes which he calls academies. He, too, who spends his days in dispensing his existing knowledge to all comers, is unlikely to have either leisure or energy to acquire new. tell that to the research assessment committees. This emphasis was upended in my own day when academics were judged and promoted on their research, and their skills as a teacher took a very definite second place. I'm told that some place is now made for good teachers, and Marina Warner has just announced that the stress has been reversed in Essex in order to milk the cash cow of foreign students, who are worth much more than distinguished researchers. Moreover, I find Newman's remarks difficult to reconcile with his own great enterprise of scholarship at Oxford, the explication of the teaching of the early fathers of the Church, to which he devoted 14 years of work. A place of research might also have given him the argument that useless research may turn out to be very useful indeed. Neither the need for classics nor for the Christian faith prevail in the university today, so that it might well be asked what relevance Newman's idea of a university can possess for us, especially given that even a student in a Catholic university can avoid theology altogether. Newman assumed that universities existed for the leisured, hence the wider association of the term gentleman, who might expect to have a private income, to the exclusion of women and the working class, though he looked forward with hope to the extension of knowledge beyond this body to the middle classes. In his own day, he was not, in the strictest terms, an elitist. Yet one of the characteristics of Stephen Collini's discussion of Newman in this little book is his wonder that a work so irrelevant to the modern world should still possess so much influence and authority. After all, he himself has actually written a chapter about it. He ascribes this in part simply to the passion with which Newman addresses his subject. As we look over the extraordinary range of subjects taught in the modern university and its domination by a modern science divided into highly specialist disciplines, we can see that there's no single discipline which provides a unity to the curriculum or the material for the end or aim of the university, the inculcation of a liberal education. A university is now, it's been said, a collection of departments united by a heating system. When I was young, I thought that in the absence of the classics, English literature, especially English poetry, might furnish us with such a common culture. But one of the great generational gulfs between old and young now is a knowledge of, say, Wordsworth's daffodils. Yet some of Newman's habits of mind and intellect can be learned in the sciences, such as exactitude and precision, in the relations of various disciplines to one another. Other qualities which he extols seem to me to be intrinsic to the humanities, as when Copleston says that the classical histories inculcate a love of country. There is a continuing debate, as we heard this morning, on the uselessness or otherwise of university subjects, especially now that they are largely funded by the taxpayer. Yet for 40 years I have been an academic historian in departments of theology, and there are 3 modern synonyms for uselessness: that something is of merely theological, or merely academic, or merely historical interest. The adjectives dogmatic and intellectual have a reputation as bad. Yet although dated perhaps in many ways, Newman's book, as we see, is still regarded with reverence, in the absence of any rival work of the same rhetorical and literary power. You could say that it retains its eminence, as Marx said of John Stuart Mill, from the flatness of the surrounding ground. The best case for Newman was made by the great historian of Victorian England, G.M. Young, who described the idea of a university with Aristotle's ethics as making all other books on education superfluous, all education and not merely higher education. Young writes that Newman employs all his magic to enlarge and refine and exalt this conception of intellectual cultivation as a good in itself worthwhile for itself, to be prized and esteemed for itself, beyond all knowledge and professional skill, while all the time so earnestly does he affirm its inadequacy, its shortcomings on the moral side, its need to be steadied and purified by religion, that at the end we feel that what we have heard is the final utterance, never to be repeated or needing to be supplemented, of Christian humanism, as if the spirit evoked by Erasmus had found its voice at last. Newman would not have liked being compared to Erasmus, but here his value lies in his primary idea, the love of knowledge for its own sake, which I hope can exist in any discipline, as it transforms our consciousness with delight into a thing of beauty and a joy forever.
Thank you very, very much indeed. I thought that was a profound lecture, enlivened by some wash-this humour every few minutes.
Some of the Newmans.
Thank you so much. Questions, comments, discussion?
Sister, I haven't reduced you to speechlessness.
This may not be on beam, as it were, but one question that was going around in my mind as you were speaking, and you mentioned Louvain,
Yes.
was, and I don't know the answer to this in the slightest, whether Newman was influenced by other continental universities in what he had to say about Britain and Ireland.
Yeah. Well, of course, he had actually attended. He had been to Rome for his priestly training, and he had submitted a thesis in Rome. For the life of me, I've just forgotten what it was. But oh yes, I think it was about the development of doctrine, in which matter he was actually encouraged by Peroni. But I think he had the feeling that the Roman universities were really getting by on the basis of a past theology rather than a present one. He felt that Rome was not a centre of lively intellectual theological debate, and he had great difficulty finding points of contact with it. Peroni, I think, was his best point of contact, and otherwise, I don't think he was impressed by the Roman universities at all.
And he had nothing to say about the other European universities.
Oh yes, a good deal. I mean, he wrote a great deal about medieval universities. They're in volume 3 of the historical sketches. He's very interested in that. He did quite a lot of historical work of one kind and another on this. I imagine that he was taking a secondary text and reproducing it, but it's all redone in his own distinctive idiom.
Yes, I was thinking mainly of contemporary experiences of European universities in the 19th century.
Well, of course, a lot of them had been secularized with the French Revolution, hadn't they?
Yes.
And he did say that this was the greatest want of the Roman Catholic Church in his own day, that it had lost so many of its schools at the French Revolution, so the theological or intellectual aspect of the life of the Church had gone down the tubes.
There's actually points. I spent time in the Oratory in Birmingham looking at Newman's papers and the Irish collections of books. In one particular box, he has Newman collected curriculum from several universities, including the University of New South Wales. So he was looking as far afield as Australia and New Zealand when he was in terms of designing his own curriculum for Dublin.
And I think by the 1850s, Archbishop Holding had actually formed some kind of Catholic college in New South Wales, hadn't he? But of course, it depends what you call a college. And I can remember being told at Oxford, when I was in Merton, about the claim of, I think it's New College, is it, to be the oldest Oxford university?
Yes. I think
That
no.
half a dozen...
Second.
Sorry?
Yeah, second, I think.
Merton is the second, yes. But they're claiming of New College that
Yes.
half a dozen coins in a tin box doesn't make a college. Speaking of New College.
Leslie Smith.
Thank you. That was terrifically interesting. And I wondered what you thought about the idea of residence, because what comes to mind is my father-in-law's reminiscence of being conscripted into the army after the war, which he basically spent 2 years teaching illiterate soldiers how to read and write. And in many ways, although he became a professor himself, he thought that that was the most useful work he'd ever done. And it also introduced him to an enormous variety of people that he would never have met. And so did Newman think that this had to happen at university, or is the idea of common residence with people what is somehow creating of the gentlemanly nature?
Well, he was considering the creation of something on the model of mechanics institutes at the Oratory itself at one time, and I can't quite remember what actually became of that. But of course, an institution like the Oratory did a great deal of miscellaneous teaching. I mean, they had schools, they had an orphanage, but I think he was so dominated by the Oxford experience that, you know, he did have difficulty actually thinking outside it. I must say that I'm a great fan of the Open University. I mean, my daughter did a 6-year course there and took a first, which has been, you know, the opening up really of her professional career. And it's simply not possible nowadays for many people to do a residential course. So if you ask whether I'm in favour of other forms of learning than a residential university, I am very much so. On the other hand, you know, I mean, I remember Cambridge, and it had a kind of indelible effect upon me, and you know, my eyes fill with tears when I think of it, and that was Newman's feeling about Oxford.
I think possibly when we're talking about residential, we're talking about community. So that with the internet and everything else, then even students of the Open University can join a community, whether it be a forum or a private or a place. So there is that. I think there's that idea of community still in place, which I think Newman was getting at, because we obviously wouldn't call it modern developments. But it's about communication and talking to one another and socialising as well. I think that's kind of maybe what it's getting at.
I do think, though, you see, that the idea of a university, in a way, asks as many questions as it answers. I mean, for example, one wouldn't have a school of Catholic engineering, but one would somehow keep the Catholic engineers in their place, so that they didn't take ideas from engineering and deprave theology with them. He's got some sort of conception of a kind of balance or tension between all these different departments, as in this notion of balance between, you know, prophet, priest, and king, the law, reason, and devotion. That he's always looking for an equilibrium, if you like, and the trouble is that so much of the idea of a university is formed in terms of abstractions, which are rather then difficult to create. He doesn't give you an example. You know, if I had a school of engineering in a Catholic university, I would tell them this and that. You know, you really have to apply the abstraction yourself to the particular departments that you might be considering. Does it make a sort of sense? Because as we know, I mean, there are certain science departments which raise questions which are deeply unsettling for religion. And do you have a school of Catholic evolutionary science, for example, in a Catholic university? That might be regarded as a troubling question. I'm not sure whether I've answered your question. The other thing I felt listening to, I mean, we seem to have had the old, the middle, and the new so far, and listening to the previous speaker, I felt a bit outdated.
I think
this idea of academic community, of residential, how do you want to express it? I actually think it is an aspect of university education that we might be in danger of losing. Or because if you have a model of education that basically sees education as a product, something you sell, it inevitably becomes, we sell it to you, we have it and you want it. Whereas I think that my own experience, my own university days, Newman's absolutely right, you learn as much or perhaps more from your fellow students as you do from the lecturers. Talking about your work with other people, with your peers, I think is an exceptionally important part of education. And while I think the sort of new media and whatnot, the internet and so on, can help us with those discussions, I think only in a limited way, and I think it's not the same to have a late night drunken talk about philosophy over a bottle of wine in a student room as it is to type stuff on an internet forum. I think they're not the same experience, and so I do regret. I was chaplain in Leicester, De Montfort University as well, and De Montfort, pretty much all the students turned up to lectures and went home and stayed and lived at home. They weren't residential in that sense. And I think they did miss out on something very significant. And so I do think there's something, and I think, as I say, I think that it's connected with this idea that really it's the lecturers who have the product and we, the students, then buy it from those lecturers. Whereas in fact that's not how education works in my experience.
Because Newman is speaking about community in two senses. Community among the undergraduates, in which everything you say actually applies. But then he seems to have this conception of university as a kind of community of philosopher academics who assist and cooperate with one another, whereas his own history in the University of Oxford was one of unremitting conflict. I think that there is almost a tendency among Catholics sometimes, I'm not saying you're doing it, for the word community to come out as an unambiguously good thing, when we know that communities are divided in themselves and that communities conflict violently with other communities. And in some ways, if you come from a very restricted background, that background and your membership of the community in that background might be the enemy of a university education. If you came from a very fundamentalist Christian background, for example, in which you were unwilling to learn from your teachers. I'm just thinking of some of the fundamentalist undergraduates I've had in the past. They were the creation of communities, all right, but they were a problem.
Bernard Longdon.
Thank you. My question was to come back to the word scholarship and research. Seems a big issue in his ideas. And really to take the title, the idea of a university now, of course, today you would struggle to say that a university can be without its research. And yet, at that point in time, it seemed to be quite an accepted way forward. I wonder if you'd like to just make tease out some of those ideas.
Perhaps I could just quote this line from the idea. There is no situation which combines respectability with lightness of responsibility and labour so happily as the office of a professor. Now, all the professors I know have got to their situation by hard, unremitting research work. Some of them have been good teachers, but that's been almost irrelevant to their promotion to that rank. And so I think there is a tension between teaching and research. And I've known young researchers who, because they think of their career in terms of promotion on the basis of their research have sadly neglected their students and their teaching. I mean, I think that's just that really is a major problem.
It's actually interesting because Newman himself might have been a victim of that because he employed Eugene Curry, Professor of Archaeology, on the basis of what he published. And similarly, he offered Dollinger the job because of his research. So, you know, maybe things haven't changed as much as Newman himself might have believed.
He even devised, didn't he? He got the printer to devise a form of type for Carrie's Irish. Is it called Newman? I think it might actually. What is it called?
I'm not sure.
Yeah. In other words, he was attempting, to form some kind of connection with the setting in which he found himself. He wasn't simply a visiting arrogant Englishman. Well, as you can see, his model gentleman was not at least like that. I mean, he is a feudal idea almost of politeness, kindness, and gentility.
Sister Maura.
I'd just like to make a comment about Christian community from the experience of the school.
Yeah.
That the big problem in any Catholic school is to have what people do and what people say must match. Because the youngsters will copy what people do and not listen to what they say if they're not the same thing. And in a sense, as you are creating a community, you're not the RE teaching is important, but what is important is to foster the relationships between both teachers and the students, the youngsters you're having, and based upon the gospel, which is to be charitable, that the kindness and compassion towards one another, and that really, to my mind, is what you're trying to do when you're making a Christian community. But I don't know that you can teach it in a curriculum. It comes from attitudes and a shared experience among those who are leading it, and a certain level of acceptance among those who are being led, if you like, and allowing them to quarrel with it.
Yeah, but you're speaking of a situation in which people are actually becoming teachers when they've already made a very important religious commitment.
No, I'm talking about an ordinary school.
Right, I see.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because and it is a community. I mean, you're fostering a community, but how you can actually teach that, especially at a level of higher education, or I really would find it very difficult because the numbers you're dealing with, the differences of curriculum, and a much wider concept.
Yes. But I mean, it is all, as you say, all by example, isn't it?
Yes.
But I mean, the paradox of Newman's idea of university, in a way, is that he seems to be imagining the possibility of the creation of a community which is not religious, which simply has as its end or aim the pursuit of knowledge, and that's. And then he brings in religion to provide a kind of corrective to the type which that pursuit of knowledge creates. And it just seems to me to be a bit artificial. The people don't work that way. They have a religious commitment, and they then discover knowledge as an ideal. Whereas this for him is something which is possible to anybody. It's not simply possible for a person with a religion. You can become a dedicated teacher because you love knowledge for its own sake, without having any kind of wider theological or ideological or philosophical commitment beyond this. Does that make sense? That's what I think he's saying.
Yeah.
And the more I look at it, the more unsatisfied with it I become.
Professor Gilley.
May I suggest that perhaps his argument is our best tool against narrow secularism, which actually truncates the search for truth, beauty, and goodness. A place like ours that claims to be a Christian foundation wants to be faithful to it. In fact, you should argue for the breadth of a liberal education
Yeah.
And if the clarity of that breadth is manifest,
Yeah.
the place for faith and religion becomes obvious.
Yeah. In other words, the university can be a kind of preparatio evangelica, that these ideals of the pursuit of truth, goodness and beauty can all be seen as a kind of preparation or anticipation of whatever Christianity is going to provide.
And
That's
the
very
secular-
helpful, thank you.
And the secular professor who says, leave your faith outside,
Yeah.
because this excludes it, is
Yeah.
actually shown to be narrow,
Yeah.
ipso facto.
I was just thinking of Richard Dawkins in relation to this, because he's actually written a book, hasn't he, in which he tries to show that there is a numinosity in the pursuit of scientific truth, which ought to be a satisfaction or end in itself. And he might discover that a person who has fallen in love with the cosmos, the beauty of the cosmos, through his scientific investigations, is actually impelled to ask another question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Two more interventions. They may have to be the last, and I'm not sure which is first of the two of you.
Colleagues may be aware of a book Mike Higton wrote a year 2012, A Theology of Higher Education, which is partly addressing the point that Newman, that you raise about Newman, about the place of theology of Christianity within higher education. And over against Newman, this is very helpful actually, he develops what he's an Anglican, forgive him, he develops what he calls an Anglican theology of learning, actually based on an understanding of the Eucharist, and then asks, on the basis of that Christian understanding, what can we recognise in the wider university that is good, that is, in that sense, reflective of Christianity under the power of the Spirit. Now that seems to me to be an important possible way forward in engaging as Christians with what is actually happening in higher education, what on the basis of our theology of learning can we recognise as good in the secular academy. Not making a distinction between the secular and the Christian, but arguing where can we see the Christian within the secular.
I'm sorry, I'm still name of the author. Can you just...
Mike Higton. He worked with David Ford at Cambridge, and is, I think, quite influenced by David's work and Dan Hardy behind that. He's now at Durham, actually.
Oh, well, I ought to know him, but I don't. Yes, thank you very much. Yes, I think the problem is partly, as I've said, that a lot of this seems to be taking place on a plane of very high abstraction, which isn't terribly satisfactory. A more concrete kind of study, such as this one, would be very useful.
I'm plowing through a book by Charles Taylor, which I've been reading probably for the last 4 years. Only that. But his notion,
sorry, go on.
His notion of the imaginary, which colours the way we see the world. I wonder whether Newman's invocation of theology is because that would then give us a view of the world in which God has to have a place. And I very much doubt that that's the case in modern universities. I think the imaginary of the modern university would be non-theological.
Yes, I don't know. I mean, for one thing, I noticed that cosmologists seem to be rather more religious than biologists. That puzzles me. I wonder why that happens to be the case. Are there some subjects which are more deeply imbued with some kind of Christianity than others? Some subjects which are at a particular stage in their development, or which have a logic which is actually more sympathetic to Christianity. Newman, of course, says a great deal about the role of the imagination, about the role of the impression upon people. And he thinks that's what, in the end, helps to determine our moral choices. We have to have an image of God before we can actually have a belief in God. We have to have an apprehension of God before we can actually know whom God is. And, you know, in that respect, that comes before reason. You know, it's as his, you know, famous sermon on the Annunciation, in which not on the Annunciation, when Mary stores all these things within her heart, and what she stores within her heart is not a whole series of doctrines about the Immaculate Conception or the Virgin Birth, but a whole imaginative apprehension of those doctrines, which have to do with the promises of God to Israel and what God is going to require of her.
Which would be very the sort of view that Newman would have.
Well, this is Newman's argument, you see.
But not the sort of view that most chancellors of universities.
Well, yeah. Well, I'm very dissatisfied about the teaching of New and Old Testament in departments of theology anyway. A lot of it is really very, well, never mind. I mustn't go on about that. You know, I mean, there are lots of things in theology departments, I think, which deter students from belief. And here I sound like the reigning evangelical fundamentalist I was denouncing a minute ago. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think that's been a rewarding discussion. But we must close here. But before we actually go off.